High above the frozen German landscape, a crippled American bomber limped through hostile skies, trailing smoke like a wounded bird. Inside, young men bled onto twisted metal, their breath visible in the killing cold. Behind them, a German fighter pilot closed in for what should have been an easy victory, one more kill to earn his nation's highest honor. But in the next few minutes, something would happen that defied every rule of war, every expectation of combat, every boundary between enemy and human being. Two pilots separated by language, nationality, and the machinery of destruction would share a moment that neither military manual nor propaganda poster had prepared them for. What began as a hunt would become something else entirely, an act so unexpected that it would remain classified as a military secret for nearly 5 decades, buried not because it revealed tactical weakness, but because it exposed something far more dangerous to the machinery of total war, the persistence of individual conscience in the face of collective hatred. December 20th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Bremen. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown felt the B-17 shudder as the first shell of German flak tore through the nose section. The sound, a metallic shriek followed by the whistle of depressurizing air, cut through the engine roar. Glass exploded inward. The bombardier's scream lasted only a second before the wind stole it away. Brown's hands tightened on the yoke, his 21-year-old knuckles white against the controls. Through the windscreen, he could see other fortresses in formation, their olive-drab fuselages steady against the winter clouds, still maintaining the tight combat box that doctrine demanded. They looked impossibly distant now, though they were only hundreds of feet away. Another explosion. The aircraft dropped 50 feet. Brown's stomach lurched. Behind him, someone was shouting coordinates, but the words made no sense anymore. The instrument panel flickered. Oil pressure dropping on engine number 2, then number 4. The temperature gauges spun wildly. He could smell burning wire, hot metal, something else. Copper, he realized with sick clarity. Blood had its own distinctive smell at altitude, sharper somehow in the thin, cold air. They had crossed into German airspace 37 minutes earlier. The briefing that morning, was it only 4 hours ago, had promised moderate resistance. The intelligence officer, a thin major with coffee stains on his uniform, had circled Bremen on the wall map with casual confidence. "Industrial target," he'd said. "In and out. You'll be back for lunch." Brown had believed him. They all had. The bacon had been crisp that morning, the eggs almost fresh. Someone had made a joke about German beer. Everyone had laughed. Now the Ye Olde Pub, named in a moment of homesick humor by a crew that averaged 22 years of age, was dying. Brown could feel it in the way she responded to his touch, sluggish, reluctant, like a horse that knows it cannot finish the race. The bomber had been struck 9 times by anti-aircraft fire. 9 times. Each hit registered in his body as well as in the aircraft, a shared nervous system of man and machine. The nose was shattered. The tail section Swiss-cheesed with holes you could put your fist through. Oxygen lines severed. 2 engines silent, their propellers windmilling uselessly. And the men. God, the men. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was dead. Brown knew this not because anyone had reported it. The intercom was crackling with static and contradictory information, but because the tail guns had gone silent 10 minutes ago, and Eckenrode would never voluntarily stop firing. Not Eckenrode, who had grown up hunting deer in Pennsylvania, and who treated his twin 50 caliber machine guns with the same careful attention he'd once given to his father's rifle. The other gunners had wounds. The ball turret operator had taken shrapnel in the leg. The waist gunner couldn't hear anything anymore after the concussion of a near miss, but they were breathing. Breathing was enough. Breathing was everything. Brown pushed the yoke forward, dropping altitude. At 27,000 feet without oxygen, they would pass out in minutes. The masks hung useless, hissing empty air from severed lines. Better to descend, to find breathable atmosphere, even if it meant exposing themselves to ground fire, to small arms, to the focused attention of German fighters who prowled the lower altitudes like wolves waiting for the wounded to separate from the herd. The formation above them, what was left of it, continued east without them. Brown watched them go without resentment. This was doctrine. This was survival. The combat box existed to provide mutual defensive fire, overlapping fields from dozens of machine guns that could shred an attacking fighter. A single bomber alone was just a target. Everyone knew this. Everyone had seen the gun camera footage, the grainy black and white films of isolated fortresses spiraling down, black smoke trails marking their descent like accusatory fingers pointing at the sky. 15,000 feet, 12,000. The air grew thicker, warmer. Brown could breathe again without gasping. Behind him, someone was crying. Another voice was praying, the words fast and jumbled. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, blessed art thou. The navigator appeared beside him, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, holding a hand-drawn map that was mostly smeared red fingerprints. Channel, the navigator said, pointing northwest with a shaking finger. That way? Maybe. Maybe. The word that defined their existence now. Maybe they could maintain altitude. Maybe the two remaining engines wouldn't fail. Maybe the German fighters circling somewhere in the clouds above wouldn't notice a single crippled bomber limping toward the coast at 8,000 feet, slow and obvious as a wounded deer crossing an open field. Feldwebel Franz Stigler had been having an excellent war until that morning. At 27 years old, he was a veteran of campaigns in North Africa, the Eastern Front, and now the defense of the Reich itself. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 wore the scars of 270 combat missions, patched bullet holes, replaced panels, engine cowling that didn't quite match the original factory paint. The ground crew called it Old Sparrow, though Stigler himself never used the name. Names implied affection, and affection for machinery was dangerous in a profession where machinery regularly failed at the worst possible moments. He had landed at Yevor Airfield just 17 minutes earlier, his fuel tanks nearly empty after engaging a formation of American bombers near Oldenburg. One confirmed kill, a B-17 that had broken formation, streaming smoke from its No. 3 engine. He'd attacked from below, the sun behind him, exactly as his instructor had taught him 3 years ago. A 2-second burst into the wing root. Fire bloomed orange against the gray sky. The bomber went down. He didn't watch it fall. You never watch them fall. The moment you stopped paying attention to the sky around you was the moment another fighter put bullets through your canopy. The debriefing had taken 9 minutes. Major Gustav Rödel, his commanding officer and the man who had kept Stigler alive through a dozen near-death encounters, had clapped him on the shoulder. "One more," Rödel had said. "One more, and the Ritterkreuz is yours." The Knight's Cross. The small piece of metal and ribbon that separated the merely competent from the legendary. Stigler had nodded, said nothing. You didn't talk about medals before you earned them. Bad luck. He was walking toward the mess hall thinking about coffee, real coffee if the mess sergeant hadn't substituted acorn powder again, when the alarm sounded. A mechanical wail that sent pilots sprinting toward their aircraft. No time for pre-flight checks. No time for careful instrument inspection. Just run, climb, start engine, go. The ground crew chief, a stocky Bavarian named Klaus, who smelled perpetually of engine oil, was already hauling the fuel hose toward the Messerschmitt. "Crippled fortress," Klaus shouted over the alarm. 8,000 meters, heading northwest. Easy kill. Easy kill. The words followed Stigler as he climbed into the narrow cockpit, as his hands moved through the startup sequence with practiced efficiency. Magnetos, fuel mixture, throttle. The Daimler-Benz engine caught on the second try, 12 cylinders hammering to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Stigler pulled the canopy closed, checked his ammunition counters. 760 rounds for the nose-mounted machine guns, 60 rounds for the 20-millimeter cannon. More than enough for a bomber that couldn't defend itself. He lifted off after 38 seconds of taxi, the Messerschmitt eager to leave the ground. At 240 kilometers per hour, the fighter wanted to fly more than it wanted to roll. Stigler let it rise, banking northwest according to the coordinates the controller had barked over the radio. The winter sky was mostly clear, high cirrus clouds that caught the afternoon sun, lower cumulus that cast moving shadows on the farmland below. Peaceful. You could almost forget there was a war, except for the contrails that marked where the American formations had passed. white lines drawn across the blue canvas like the trails of migrating birds. He found the fortress after 6 minutes of searching. At first he thought it was a debris cloud. The bomber was so riddled with holes that daylight showed through the fuselage in a dozen places. The tail section looked like someone had attacked it with an axe. The vertical stabilizer was mostly gone, just twisted metal ribs and shredded fabric. One engine was completely missing, torn from its mount, leaving only bent struts and dangling cables. Another engine was dark, propeller stopped. The 2 remaining engines were running, but one was trailing thin black smoke that dissipated quickly in the slipstream. Stigler approached from behind and below, throttling back to match the bomber's painfully slow speed. Perhaps 250 kilometers per hour, maybe less. At this speed, his Messerschmitt felt mushy, unwilling, constantly threatening to stall. He advanced the throttle slightly, came closer. Through the holes in the bomber's fuselage, he could see movement. Men. One was slumped over a gun mount, not moving. Another was trying to apply a bandage to someone else's shoulder, his hands clumsy with cold and shock. The waist gunner turned slowly, saw Stigler's fighter, then turned away again, too exhausted or too injured to man his weapon. Stigler moved to the bomber's right side, where the pilot could see him. The cockpit glass was starred with cracks, partially covered with what looked like blood spray. The pilot's face was visible, young, impossibly young, with the kind of soft features that suggested he should still be in university somewhere, studying literature or engineering or whatever American boys studied before the war reached out and grabbed them. The pilot looked at Stigler. Their eyes met. In that moment, separated by 50 feet of air and the entire machinery of industrial warfare, they were just 2 men who could see each other's faces. Charlie Brown saw the German fighter and knew he was about to die. The Messerschmitt was close enough that he could see the pilot's leather helmet, the oxygen mask hanging loose at his throat, the gloved hand resting on the control stick. This was how it ended then. Not with the dramatic explosion of a direct flak hit, not with the long, tumbling descent through clouds, but with a few seconds of cannon fire at point-blank range. Quick at least. Probably quick. He thought about his mother in Weston, West Virginia. She would receive a telegram, the War Department regrets to inform you, and she would cry in the kitchen that smelled of baking bread and floor wax, and his younger brother would try to be the man of the house, and life would continue without him, as if he had never existed. 21 years on Earth, erased by a few ounces of German steel traveling at the speed of sound. But the German wasn't firing. The Messerschmitt hung there, matching the bomber's speed, its propeller a blurred disk, exhaust stains dark against the engine cowling. Brown could see the black cross on the fuselage, the swastika on the tail. Enemy markings, the symbols that briefings had taught him to hate, to fear, to destroy on sight. But the pilot wearing those symbols was just watching him, head turning slightly, looking at the ruined bomber with what might have been calculation or might have been something else. The German pilot gestured, pointed down, pointed west, toward Sweden, the neutral country where damaged aircraft sometimes fled, where crews could sit out the rest of the war in comfortable internment rather than freezing in a German POW camp. Brown shook his head. Sweden was too far. They'd never make it. The 2 remaining engines were already running rough, their temperature gauges climbing into the red. Another 20 minutes, maybe 30, and they'd fail completely. Better to aim for England, for the Channel, for home, however impossible that seemed. The German pilot gestured again, more insistently. Land. Land now. Save your crew. Brown kept shaking his head. He didn't know why. Stubbornness, maybe. Or training that ran deeper than conscious thought. Never surrender the aircraft. Never give the enemy anything they can study or reverse engineer or parade through a city as proof of victory. Or maybe just the simple animal refusal to give up while the engine still ran and the wings still provided lift and the controls still responded to his hands. The Messerschmitt moved closer, 30 feet away, 20. So close Brown could see the wear patterns on the fighter's canopy, the scratches where the pilot had scraped away frost or debris. The German pilot looked at him again, And this time Brown saw something in the other man's face. Not hatred, not the killing fury he'd expected, but something complicated and uncertain. Conflict, decision. Franz Stigler remembered Lieutenant Gustav Rodel's words from 2 years earlier, spoken during training at Yevor, when Stigler was still new enough to feel excitement rather than dread before each mission. "If you ever shoot at a man in a parachute," Rodel had said, his voice quiet but absolute, "I will shoot you myself. We are fighter pilots. We kill machines, not defenseless men." The words had seemed academic at the time, part of the elaborate code that separated military aviators from mere killers. But Stigler had never forgotten them, and now, looking at this destroyed bomber held aloft by nothing but momentum and the stubborn will of its pilot, he understood. The airplane was already dead. It just didn't know enough to fall yet. The men inside were no different from paratroopers drifting under silk canopies, defenseless, defeated, at the mercy of anyone who chose to show none. And Stigler could show mercy. He had 27 minutes of fuel remaining. Enough to escort this broken aircraft to the coast, to use his presence to shield it from ground fire, to give these young Americans, these boys who looked like his brother, who looked like the university students he'd once drunk beer with in Munich, a chance to reach their own territory. It would cost him nothing but fuel and the possibility of the Knight's Cross. The Knight's Cross. The medal he'd been chasing for 2 years, through sandstorms in Africa, and frozen hell on the Eastern Front, and the daily meat grinder above Germany, as American bombers came in their hundreds, their thousands, an endless stream of 4-engine targets that kept coming no matter how many you shot down. One more kill. That's all Rodel had said. One more. This bomber would count. Its condition was irrelevant. The Luftwaffe credited kills based on official confirmation, and any German on the ground who saw this wreck would understand that Stigler had done the work. One burst from his cannons, wait for the inevitable explosion or the final plunge to earth, and the paperwork would process as smoothly as a factory assembly line. Lieutenant Stigler becomes Oberleutnant Stigler, the Knight's Cross recipient, the hero. But Lieutenant Rodel would know. Stigler would know. And knowing, he would see that reflection in the mirror every morning, for whatever years remained to him. Assuming he survived the war, assuming Germany survived the war, assumptions that felt less certain with each passing month, as the American bomber streams grew larger and the Luftwaffe fighter groups grew smaller. He would see himself as the man who machine-gunned helpless teenagers because a piece of metal and ribbon mattered more than the code that separated him from the SS officers who shot prisoners in ditches. Stigler made his decision. He edged the Messerschmitt closer to the bomber, positioned his fighter on the B-17's right side, where any German anti-aircraft gunner would see both aircraft together and, hopefully, hold fire rather than risk hitting one of their own fighters. It was thin protection depending on the discipline and recognition skills of men who had been trained to shoot first and question later. But it was something. The American pilot was staring at him with confusion that Stigler could read even through the cracked cockpit glass. "Why aren't you shooting? Why are you staying so close?" The questions hung between them, unanswerable across the gap of language and altitude and opposing uniforms. Stigler pointed northwest again, more gently this time. Not an order, a suggestion, a plea. Save yourself. Land. But the American kept shaking his head, kept pointing the bomber's nose toward the distant channel, toward England, toward home. Stubborn. Brave and stubborn, and probably foolish. The qualities that made good fighter pilots and dead heroes. Stigler understood both impulses intimately. The rational calculation that said, land now, live to fight another day, and the deeper animal loyalty that said, never quit, never surrender, get your crew home, no matter the cost. He had felt both impulses himself multiple times in skies over Russia, where the winter killed as efficiently as Soviet fighters, in the Mediterranean, where engine failure meant drowning in cold water, in the desperate battles over Germany itself, where every mission might be your last because there were simply too many enemies and not enough of you. So he stayed, formation flying with the enemy, the most absurd thing he'd done in a war filled with absurdities. The Messerschmitt and the B-17, dancing together at 250 kilometers per hour, 8,000 feet above German territory, while the war continued around them in 1,000 other places where men killed each other according to orders and regulations and the neat categories that made sense in briefing rooms. The minutes stretched. Brown stopped trying to understand what was happening and focused on the only thing that mattered, keeping the bomber in the air. The yoke fought him constantly now, the fortress trying to roll right because of asymmetric thrust, trying to nose down because of damaged control surfaces. He trimmed as best he could, but trim tabs could only compensate so much. His arms ached. The muscle between his shoulder blades had gone from burning to numb to burning again. He'd been holding the aircraft level for 43 minutes since the last flak burst, and every second added weight to the invisible load. The navigator appeared beside him again, still bleeding but more coherent. "German fighters still with us," the navigator said unnecessarily. "I can see that." "Why isn't he shooting?" Brown had no answer. The question had been cycling through his mind for the last 10 minutes, generating possibilities that ranged from plausible to insane. Gun jam, out of ammunition, radio communication with ground control, waiting for orders. Some elaborate German trick he couldn't fathom. Or, and this seemed most impossible, the German pilot had simply chosen not to kill them. The coastline appeared ahead, a dark line separating winter-brown land from winter-gray sea. The North Sea. 50 miles to England. 50 miles over water in a bomber with 2 engines and a fuel supply that Brown estimated, based on gauges that might or might not be accurate, would last perhaps 30 minutes. Maybe 40 if God was feeling generous and the winds were favorable. The German fighter pulled ahead slightly, waggled its wings, the international signal for attention, and pointed north, away from the direct route to England, away from the concentration of German naval vessels that the intelligence briefings had marked in red on the navigation maps. A safe corridor, maybe, or another trick. Brown had no way of knowing. Trust the enemy who had just escorted you 20 miles without firing a shot, or trust your own navigation over hostile waters with failing engines? He chose trust. The word felt strange even in his thoughts, applied to a man wearing a swastika. But what else could you call it? Brown adjusted course 5 degrees north, following the fighter's suggestion. The Messerschmitt slid back into formation, matching speed and altitude with the same precision it had maintained since that first incomprehensible moment when the German pilot had chosen observation over execution. They crossed the coastline at 7,900 feet. The anti-aircraft batteries below held their fire, whether because they recognized the Messerschmitt or simply because both aircraft were too fast and too low for an effective solution, Brown would never know. The land fell away behind them, replaced by waves that looked black and cold and unforgiving. The Channel crossing. The gamble. Everything depended now on engines that were already dying, on fuel that was already running out, on luck that had already been stretched impossibly thin. The German fighter stayed with them for another 7 minutes, long enough to clear the immediate coastal defenses, long enough to put them on a track toward England. Long enough, Brown realized with something close to vertigo, for the German pilot to be in genuine danger himself. 7 minutes deeper into Allied territory meant 7 minutes more fuel burned, 7 minutes less margin for error on the return flight. Then the Messerschmitt pulled ahead, slowly, climbing slightly. The German pilot looked back one final time. Brown could see his face clearly in the afternoon light, not the face of propaganda, not the twisted features of the inhuman enemy from training posters, but just a man, tired and maybe sad, and definitely not young anymore, despite being only a few years older than Brown himself. The German raised his gloved hand in salute, a gesture Brown had learned on the parade ground at training command, the same sharp motion from forehead to temple that every military pilot knew, formal, respectful, acknowledging something that had happened here, something neither of them had words for. Brown returned the salute. His hand shook from exhaustion and adrenaline, and a dozen other emotions he couldn't name. The German pilot nodded once, then broke formation, banking hard right, accelerating away. The Messerschmitt climbed into the afternoon sun. its engine note changing as the pilot advanced throttle, pushed speed, raced back toward Germany and whatever awaited him there. Court-martial, maybe, or celebration, or nothing at all. Just another sortie marked in the logbook with careful handwriting. The fortress continued west. Just the crippled bomber now, alone over water, engines coughing and fuel gauge needles dropping toward empty. But alive, still flying, still carrying 9 men who had expected to die and somehow hadn't. 9 men who would have to explain this to intelligence officers who would not believe them, to commanders who would immediately classify the story as secret, to themselves in the years ahead when they remembered that afternoon above the North Sea and wondered what exactly had happened there, what covenant had briefly superseded the larger machinery of war. The Olde Pub reached England on 2 failing engines and fumes. Brown put her down at Seething, the first airfield he saw, the landing gear collapsing on touchdown because the hydraulics had finally failed completely. The bomber skidded a quarter-mile down the grass runway, sparks streaming from the crushed fuselage, the scream of metal on earth, before sliding to a stop at an angle that made the whole aircraft look broken and defeated, and somehow triumphant. The crew climbed out slowly, helping the wounded first. Someone was laughing, the kind of laughter that sounds like crying, hysterical relief that you survived when you absolutely should not have survived. The ball turret gunner kissed the ground, actually kissed the frozen English grass, then threw up from shock and pain and released tension. The medical teams arrived with stretchers and morphine. The intelligence officers arrived with clipboards and questions. Brown told them everything: the flak damage, the missing engine, the dead tail gunner, the German fighter that had appeared from nowhere and then refused to fire, refused to do what every regulation and training manual said German fighters always did to crippled bombers. The intelligence major listened with an expression that shifted from interest to skepticism to something harder. "You're saying a German pilot escorted you to the coast?" "Yes, sir." "Protected you from ground fire?" "Yes, sir." "Then let you go?" "Yes, sir." The intelligence major closed his notebook. "This conversation is classified. You will not discuss what happened with anyone outside this room. You will not write about it in letters home. You will not mention it to other air crews. Is that understood?" Brown understood. The story was too complicated for morale purposes, too nuanced for propaganda. It suggested the enemy might be human, might make choices that transcended orders, might recognize some code of behavior that existed independently of national loyalty. These were dangerous ideas during a total war that depended on absolute categories, us and them, good and evil, civilization and barbarism. A German pilot who showed mercy was a crack in the foundation of that certainty. The story stayed secret for 47 years. Franz Stigler landed at Yver with 11 liters of fuel remaining, barely enough to taxi to the revetment where Klaus and the ground crew waited with refueling hoses and curiosity. "Did you get it?" Klaus asked immediately. "Did you get the Knight's Cross?" Stigler shook his head. "Lost them in the clouds." It was a lie that Klaus accepted without question, because pilots lost targets in clouds all the time, especially during winter when the weather changed minute by minute and visibility could drop from 20 kilometers to nothing in seconds. Klaus shrugged and started the refueling process, already thinking about the next sortie, the next alarm, the endless cycle of launch and recovery that defined their existence. Major Rodel found Stigler in the debriefing room an hour later. "You look troubled," Rodel said. Stigler considered lying again, then decided against it. Rodel had flown too many missions, seen too much, lost too many friends to be fooled by easy deceptions. "I let one go," Stigler said quietly. "A B-17. It was already dead. The men inside were barely alive. I couldn't shoot." He waited for anger, for accusations of cowardice or treason or failure to execute orders. Instead, Rodel was silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the field where mechanics worked on fighters and fuel trucks made their rounds, and young pilots who didn't know they were about to die laughed and smoked cigarettes. "Good," Rodel said finally. "That's good. We're fighter pilots, Franz, not executioners." That night, Stigler wrote in his journal, a habit he'd maintained since the beginning of the war, careful entries that documented missions and weather and the names of men who didn't come back. He wrote about the bomber, about the young American pilot with the terrified eyes, about the decision he'd made above the North Sea. Then he closed the journal and put it away, unsure if he would ever open it again, unsure if he wanted to remember or forget. The war continued for another 17 months. Stigler flew 142 more missions. He was shot down twice, wounded once, promoted to Oberleutnant, and eventually received his Knight's Cross for actions unrelated to that December afternoon. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Stigler was 29 years old and felt twice that age. He emigrated to Canada in 1953, started a business, married, built a quiet life far from the ruins of Europe. He never forgot the American bomber. In quiet moments, driving to work, sitting in church, lying awake at 3 a.m, he would remember the holes in the fuselage, the blood-spattered cockpit glass, the young pilot's face. Sometimes he wondered if they'd made it home. Usually he assumed they'd crashed into the North Sea, their fuel exhausted, their luck finally depleted. He never tried to find out. What would be the point? The war was over. The past was past. Some questions didn't need answers. Charlie Brown returned to the United States in August 1944 after completing his required 25 missions. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters, and the Purple Heart. He went to college, became a civil servant, married, had children. He didn't talk about the war much. When people asked, he told stories about the boredom and the food and the mechanical problems, safe anecdotes that required no emotional excavation. But he thought about the German pilot. Every December 20th, every time he heard an airplane engine, every time he saw a veteran wearing a Luftwaffe cap at a reunion or in a book or on a documentary about the air war. Who was he? Why did he do it? Did he survive? The questions had no answers, so Brown learned to live with them, the way you learn to live with old injuries that ache in cold weather. In 1986, 43 years after that December afternoon, Brown decided to try to find his guardian angel. He wrote letters to German veteran organizations, to aviation historians, to former Luftwaffe pilots whose addresses he could track down through networks of wartime aviators who stayed in touch despite everything. Most letters went unanswered. Some generated polite responses that led nowhere. Sorry, cannot help. Good luck in your search. Then, in January 1990, he received a letter from Vancouver, Canada. The handwriting was careful, each letter precisely formed in the European style. The writer introduced himself as Franz Stigler, formerly Oberleutnant, formerly Jagdgeschwader 27, formerly a man who made a decision over the North Sea that he'd never told anyone about in detail, not even his wife, until he read Brown's letter asking if anyone remembered escorting a damaged B-17 to the coast in December 1943. They spoke by phone 3 days later. Both men cried. The conversation lasted 2 hours, each trying to explain what that afternoon had meant, what it had cost, what it had given. Stigler described his approach vector, the condition of the bomber, the moment he decided not to fire. Brown described the fear, the confusion, the gratitude that he'd never been able to express to anyone who would understand. They discovered they had both been haunted by the same afternoon. Both carried the memory like a secret wound. Both wondered if the other had survived. They met in person in June 1990. Stigler flew to Boston. Brown drove up from Florida, and they embraced at the airport like brothers who'd been separated by war and silence and the sheer improbability of finding each other across 5 decades. They were both in their 70s now, their hair white, their hands marked with age spots, their voices carrying the roughness of long years. But when they looked at each other, they saw the young men in the cockpits, separated by 50 feet and an entire world. The friendship that followed was deep and immediate. They spoke weekly, visited each other's homes, attended air shows and veteran reunions together, told the story publicly for the first time, breaking the classification that had kept it buried for so long. Military historians documented their account. Aviation magazines published articles. News programs ran features about the enemy pilots who became friends. The story became famous in a small corner of military history, not famous like Midway or D-Day, but known among people who cared about moments when individual choice interrupted the machinery of total war. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008 in Vancouver. He was 92 years old. Charlie Brown died 8 months later on November 24th in Miami. He was 87. They are buried thousands of miles apart, separated again by geography and the circumstances of their separate lives. But their names are linked forever in the story of that December afternoon when an act of mercy proved stronger than the boundaries of nations, stronger than the weight of propaganda, stronger than all the forces that told them they should be nothing more than killer and victim. What makes a man choose mercy over duty? The question has no simple answer. Franz Stigler was not a pacifist. He shot down 28 Allied aircraft during the war. He believed in defending his country, in the honor of the fighter pilot's code, in military discipline. But when confronted with helpless men in a dying aircraft, some deeper instinct prevailed, the recognition that these were human beings who deserved the same chance he would want for himself or his comrades. Charlie Brown was not naive about the enemy. He had seen what German fighters did to damaged bombers, had watched friends die in burning aircraft, had absorbed the propaganda that painted the enemy as fundamentally different from themselves. But when mercy appeared wearing a swastika, he recognized it for what it was and carried that recognition for the rest of his life. The story suggests that even in total war, the machinery of destruction does not fully erase individual conscience. Orders can be disobeyed. Opportunities for killing can be refused. The code that separates soldiers from murderers, ancient, unwritten, imperfectly observed, can still function even when every political and military authority demands its suspension. But the story also reveals the price of such choices. Stigler risked court-martial. Brown endured decades of silence, unable to share the most profound experience of his war. Both men carried questions that could not be answered until they found each other across nearly 50 years of separation. The bureaucracy classified their story as secret, not because it revealed tactical weaknesses, but because it suggested possibilities that total war cannot accommodate, that enemies might recognize their shared humanity, that mercy might exist independently of military regulations, that the propaganda portrait of the irredeemable other might be less than complete. This is why the story remained buried for so long. This is why it matters now. In a world still torn by conflicts that demand absolute categories and uncompromising positions, the encounter above the North Sea offers a different model. Not of peace, which neither man ever claimed to seek, but of the possibility that even in the midst of war, individual human beings can still choose to recognize each other as something more than targets. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown did not end the war. They did not change the course of history. But on December 20th, 1943, at 8,000 feet above the North Sea, they created a small space where humanity prevailed over the machinery of destruction. And in that space, however briefly, two young men in uniform decided that some things mattered more than medals, more than victory, more than the carefully maintained hatreds that made war possible. The friendship that followed, begun 47 years late but no less genuine for the delay, suggests that the recognition was mutual and permanent. They died within months of each other, their lives intertwined by a decision made in seconds but carried for a lifetime. The Knight of the Skies and the pilot of Ye Olde Pub, enemy and friend, killer and protector, two halves of a story that transcends the normal categories of war and peace, victory and defeat, us and them. What remains, beyond the facts and dates and official records, is the